What is federalism? Federalism is a system of shared sovereignty between two levels of government, your national government and your state government. Our federal government has powers that are separated from the state governments, but there are also shared powers between them. Many people think that the national government should have strict powers and that the state government should have its own certain powers that are delegated to them. However, we kind of operate on a system of federalism that is a cooperative system of federalism, where really there's a mix between powers that are shared between the state and federal. There's some overlap there. So what is federalism? With the creation of the Constitution, federalism or a federal government was born. The difference between a federal government and the federal system is below. So the federal government is the national center government, which is located in Washington, D.C., whereas federalism is that system I just mentioned that is between the national government and the state government. So try to avoid mixing those two up. So alternatives to federalism. So you have your unitary system, which is a centralized government system in which local governments exercise only those powers given to them by the central government. So basically the central government is telling them what they have the power to do. Then you have your confederal system, which is a league of independent states. So remember the Confederate States of America, this is kind of the system they operated on. It's a league of independent states joined together by a central government that has only has like a limited power over the independent states. So this is like your Articles of Confederation that was created. Really, the states had a majority of the power, and the only thing really the national government had underneath the Articles of Confederation was that legislative branch, that Congress. It had no other branches, no other control. They couldn't even tax, they couldn't even trade. They had no executive branch. That's what a confederal system is. Other countries that use federalism, you have Australia, Brazil, Canada, Germany, Mexico, Pakistan, and Switzerland. So we're not the only country that divides up national and state powers. And keep in mind, even within the state, then you have local powers too that certain municipal areas have control over and authority over. So division of powers under federalism. So in a federal system, powers are divided between the federal government and state government. This division of power is laid out to us in our Constitution within its articles and within the amendments. So there's really three types of powers that are granted to our federal government. There's express powers, which are like written out powers. There's implied powers, so those are more interpreted powers. And then there's inherent powers, which we're going to go more in depth about in a moment here. So express powers, the definition of this is it's a constitutional or statutory power that are expressly provided for by the Constitution or by congressional law. So they're actually written in the Constitution. So some examples of this is in the Constitution it states directly that Congress has the power to coin money. So that means they have the power to coin both paper and coin money. And if you looked at the articles of our Constitution, you would see that they have the power to do this. So if you look at Article 1.8.4 or 0.5, is where it says that Congress has the right to coin money. Congress also has the power to regulate interstate commerce, so the movement of money or goods from one state to another. If you look at Article 1.83, that's where it directly states in the Constitution that the government has the power to do this. Also, the 16th Amendment says that Congress has the power to impose a federal income tax, which, if you have a job, we're all subject to. Also, President has the power to make treaties and appoint certain federal offices. Once again, that is in the Constitution, and if you look in the articles, it talks about that underneath the powers of the President, and that's in Article 2.2.2. Moving on to implied powers. So implied powers these are powers that are implied by the expressed power. So about the powers we just talked in the Constitution, particularly in Article 1, Section 8 of our Constitution. So remember our Constitution, the first part of it's the preamble, the second part of it is the articles. There's 7 articles. Then after the articles is the amendments. There's 27 amendments. So Article 1, Section 8, Clause 18, talks about the necessary and proper clause. It says that Congress has the power to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying out into execution the foregoing express powers and all other powers vested by the Constitution. So this is where the gray area happens. That's where we don't have, the analogy I like to use is you don't have a dual system where you have two separate layers of federalism. Instead, it's more like a marble cake where certain powers kind of blend together, because really Congress, if they enact any type of law, they also have the power to make sure they do everything necessary to make sure it actually is properly carried out. So this is where the flexibility comes in, and the right of the federal government to create foreign policy is also an example of that. Inherited powers, these are powers not always expressly granted by the Constitution, but are necessary to ensure the nation's integrity and survival as a political entity. So some examples are the federal government has the power to regulate immigration. That's not something that really a state by state could do. It's not something a local government could do. The federal government has the power to acquire territory. This is kind of more so spelled out in the Constitution. If you look underneath Article 4, and if you look underneath Article 4.3.1, it does kind of lay out that we can acquire territory according to the Constitution, and the federal government has the power to wage war and to make peace. And the federal government only has a few inherited powers, but they are important powers for the government to possess. So powers prohibited by our federal government, so Constitution prohibits these powers. So federal government can't impose taxes on exports, so those are items or goods going to other countries, or merchandise going to other countries, passing any law that restricts certain liberties like freedom of speech or religion. So basically the federal government can't change our Bill of Rights. They can't change the rights that we are guaranteed. The federal government can't create a national public school system. Each state has its own public school system. So each state, example that for teaching, each state has its own teaching standard. Each state has its own requirement for amount of days students have to be in class, as well as amount of time they have to be in the class. That's a state decision. That's not a national decision. But a way that it's kind of a marble cake is that the government does give government mandated money or government funds to state school systems. So that's kind of a way that they're intermixed. There's also more prohibited powers that are under Article 1, Section 9 of our Constitution. So it says that there's no taxes on state exports. So you have a sales tax, but there's not a tax on it because it's from a different state. There's no preference in commerce for one state over another. There's no spending without appropriation by law. There's no titles of nobility. There's no treaties or coining of money or bills of credit, or no bills of attainder for titles of nobility. So they really were worried when they created the Constitution of people having a nobility title. Those are all things that are prohibited by the federal government. Powers granted to the state government. So each state has its own police department, the powers of the government body that enable it to create laws for the protection of the health, morals, safety, and welfare of the people. So every state has its own state statute book, its own laws written out. Now, obviously, our laws that we make in our state cannot conflict with federal laws. So police powers are not powers for police officers. Examples, police powers are written in the 10th Amendment. So police powers just simply mean, if you've ever read the 10th Amendment, it says basically that undelegated powers are reserved to states and to the people. So if it's not stated in the Constitution that it's a federal power, then that power belongs to the state government. So states have the power to regulate commerce within its borders, so money, trade. States have the power to maintain state militia, so that's like our Wisconsin National Guard. And as I mentioned before, they regulate public schools, and they have the power to regulate marriage and divorce. That's why some states have same-sex marriage, some states don't, because that's a power that the state has. Powers prohibited to state governments. If you look underneath Article 1, Section 10, denies certain powers to states. So states can't tax goods that are coming from other states. As I mentioned before, states can't enter into treaties with other countries. That's a federal thing. The 13th, 14th, 15th, 19th, 24th, and 26th Amendments also prohibit actions that states can take. So the 13th Amendment is slavery, so it means that that's not a state policy. States can't have slaves if they decide they want slaves. That's a federal policy. It's prohibited over our whole continental United States. The 14th Amendment, which is our guarantee of due process and equal protection of all citizens. Our 15th Amendment is our protecting of voting rights. This is where it kind of gets eerie because many states believe that that's a state power, that states are able to decide how voting goes. That's why, like, we have voter ID in Wisconsin, which is a new thing for this election. The 19th Amendment, which is women's suffrage. So a state can't say that women can't vote. That's a federal law that every woman can vote. And the 26th Amendment just means that you have to be 18 in every state to vote, regardless of what state you're in. So history shows that states lose and gain powers over the years, but the U.S. Supreme Court is the ultimate, basically, they're kind of like the of the Constitution, and they decide the outcomes of disputes over powers that states have and don't have. So sometimes the powers kind of shift back and forth between what the federal government has the power to do and what the state government has to do. Because like I said, unless it's express power, those implied or inherited powers, that's where kind of the gray area comes. So interstate relations, so the relationship among the states in our federal system is sometimes referred to as a horizontal federalism. So the full faith and credit clause requires each state to honor every other state's public acts, records, and judicial proceedings. So this is where we get into that gray territory again. If a couple gets married, a same-sex couple gets married in one state, and then they go back to a state that doesn't have same-sex marriage, should they be allowed to still be technically seen as married or not? You have your interstate compacts, which are agreements between two or more states to regulate the use or protection of certain resources like water, oil, and gas. Wisconsin and Minnesota also have an interstate relationship known as reciprocity, which is where students from Wisconsin can attend Minnesota schools without having to pay out-of-state tuition. And then you have your concurrent powers, which are powers that can be exercised by both the federal and state government. So both state and federal governments can levy taxes. So that's why you have state tax, you have a federal tax. They can both borrow money. They can both have banks and corporations. They can both make and enforce laws. Like I said, we have our Wisconsin State Statute Book. We have Wisconsin courts, circuit courts, district courts. We have a Supreme Court, which you will be going to see next week. In action, which is our Wisconsin Supreme Court. It's not the federal Supreme Court. So every state has the right to establish their own courts as well. And then there's the Supremacy Clause. Plain and simple, it just means that the Constitution is the supreme law of the land, and that every state must recognize the Constitution as the supreme law of the land.